Welcome to today's talk entitled Circle of Senses, Circle of Stars. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Brian. I lived in Camp Hill communities for about a decade and trained in curative education and social therapy. I work with the insights of Rudolf Steiner and live with many of them as working hypotheses. That is to say, I live with the ideas and live out of them as much as I can as a kind of action research. So it is not a question of belief or agreeing with something or disagreeing with something, but living with these things as a question. I also use the vocabulary that Rudolf Steiner developed for his spiritual science, as most of the people that I would speak with about these topics would have some familiarity. I've agreed to give a series of talks on the senses for the Christian community in Ireland. This one is an introduction to the senses and the process of sensation as described by Rudolf Steiner. I'll give a little bit of an orientation as to who Rudolf Steiner was, and particularly in terms of his theory of knowledge, which is very important when we begin to look at the senses. Rudolf Steiner was a scientist, a philosopher, a social reformer and a seer who was mainly active at the turn of the 20th century. He lived until 1925, and most of his active work that would be closely associated with him happened in this period after 1900. Rudolf Steiner was initially a scholar of the work of the scientist and author Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. As a natural extension of this work, he looked at phenomenology, or the observation of the world in which the inner processes of the observer are integral to the perception of the world around, and integral also to forming a more human and also a spiritual science. In phenomenology, or the participatory method, we bridge the dichotomy of I and it, inside and outside, and restore the human being to being a part of nature. This method is a dynamic meeting of observer and so-called object, and so the subject matter, whether it is a plant or light or weather, requires life or dynamicism of some description. It is a science of life. But Rudolf Steiner wasn't just a scientist of the natural observable world. As a child, he had sensory experiences that could be described in common language as supernatural. Experiences of something more, beyond outer natural phenomena. While in the current scientific paradigm these experiences are often explained away or dismissed, Rudolf Steiner sought to apply the participatory method to these experiences, which we know are a common part of human experience and stories. What is the meeting point between what I experience, how it moves in me, and what truth or insight arises from this encounter? He describes these encounters with the unseen or supernatural as supersensible. The word supersensible means beyond that which is apparent to the senses. Rudolf Steiner often describes this reality as the spiritual world. But rather than being a dualist with spirit somewhere up there and matter being this firm thing underneath our feet, Steiner describes a physical world imbued with subtle supersensible qualities, which, though not directly observable to the senses, except perhaps by those with clairvoyance, that we can see the working of supersensible realities through observing processes in the physical world. A stone, for example, is physical. There is nothing dynamic to it, and it doesn't move or change unless this change is something enacted on it. With plants we can see growth and development, and recognize it as a living thing, not by looking at it once, but at how it changes over time. So there is a certain supersensible quality within that, or perhaps beyond what we can see, but which we can observe in the unfolding of time. There are also supersensible forces in animals and human beings. For example, animals have drives and will hunt for food. These are not just physical qualities, they differ hugely from this inert stone that we looked at to begin with. And all of these additional dynamic qualities can be described as supersensible. They are not just what we take in by looking at something once, but there are initial aspects to it that we can see unfold over a period of time. Rudolf Steiner takes this even a step further. If there are people who can perceive the supersensible world, as he claimed to be able to, then these capacities to sense must be possible for human beings. By this logic, they can be developed and the senses educated and inner capacities cultivated. Rather than just looking at a theory of knowledge and how we sense, he took the next step with this participatory method of research by experimenting with and passing on methods for expanding consciousness and sense experience. Of course, there was already a field exploring the supersensible as a methodology, as opposed to a purely theoretical or religious construct. This was Western esotericism, or the occult. Rudolf Steiner is now notoriously and derisively called an occultist, a word which means a practitioner of the hidden sciences. But we must be careful not to mistake Rudolf Steiner's methodology with the superstitious fringes of occult practice. Through an attitude of research, many historical inheritances were renewed or developed, and new methods arose to give us, those who work with his approach, his students, technologies for expanding consciousness, sense experience, and by extension, what we can really know. Thus, it is a methodology rather than a belief in a traditional sense, leading us, hopefully, to experiences beyond our previous possibilities. So what does this have to do with the senses? Rudolf Steiner introduced a theory of the senses that observes 12 plus senses. I say 12 plus because though he names 12 differentiated senses, he also indicates further senses, or organs of sensation, which are either embryonic, they are not yet developed to the point where they are active, or which develop out of a cultivated work with the methods of anthroposophy. Yet he offers 12 senses as a kind of archetype. Since Rudolf Steiner first spoke about these senses, many of the senses he describes have been recognized by mainstream science, while still others are more intangible, and at least for now, beyond the grasp of a Newtonian worldview. My task is to introduce these senses, and to introduce some of the ways we can look at them. Here we have a circle of the senses. We have the sense of touch, the sense of life, the sense of own movement, and the sense of balance. We have the senses of taste, smell, sight, and warmth. And we have the senses of hearing, language, thought, and of ego. I've deliberately listed these as 3 groupings of 4 senses, as in each group the senses are oriented towards a different focus. We have the so-called lower senses, being touch, life, own movement, and balance, which orientate us within our own body. We have the middle senses, taste, smell, sight, and warmth, which in various ways observe the world around us and how we interact with it. And finally we have the higher senses, the sense of hearing, the sense of language, the sense of thought, and the sense of ego. These perceive higher or supersensible aspects of the human being. These can also be described as social senses because they allow for the recognition and interaction with other human beings specifically. These latter three senses, being the sense of language or word, the sense of thought or cognition, and the sense of ego, are perhaps the least acknowledged and observed by other scientific methodologies, while the other senses, to some lesser or greater degree, are more commonly accepted. Before looking at some aspects of the big picture, the circle of the senses, I'd like to quickly introduce each of these 12 differentiations of sense experience and what they sense. I would also like to remind you this is the first of a cycle of talks on the senses, where we begin to differentiate and dive deeper with each. So this is really a whistle-stop tour. We start off with touch, tactilis, to experience something tangible. We all are familiar with the sense of touch. It gives us an experience of our own boundaries, the boundary of our own body and its relationship with the environment. And this relationship with the environment also includes the relationship with others. Next, we have the sense of life. It is a sense of organic well-being. It gives us a sense of, for example, our digestion, our circulation, our breathing. And it is a sense that is a little bit unconscious. We aren't necessarily constantly aware of the processes at work within our body. The sense of life mainly becomes apparent to us when we are ill or in discomfort. Next, we have the sense of movement. This sense is acknowledged also by contemporary science under the name proprioception. It has to do with fine and gross motor development, the relationship of one part of the body to another, and also gauging the amount of effort needed for a task. How far does one extend the muscles? The perception of force or muscle tension. Next, we have the sense of balance or equilibrium, the vestibular sense. It gives us an internal awareness of three dimensions: above, below, in front, behind, to the left, to the right, independent of gravity. So that we balance ourselves between gravity and levity. Out of the sense of balance, there comes a freeing of the arms and hands for tasks. It gives us postural security, that we don't feel like we're going to fall over. We have the sense of smell and olfactory sense, which, well, we all know what a sense of smell is. We can smell aromatic roses, or we can experience rather unpleasant smell, and these usually bring about a very emotional reaction. Then we have the sense of taste, the gustatory sense, which is our perception of, well, things that we eat as they are broken down in the mouth and as they move across sense receptors on the tongue. Observing, for example, sweet, sour, salt, so on. Then we have the sense of sight, of vision, and this, from a certain perspective, could more accurately be called a sense of light, or a sense of light and darkness. It allows us to experience visually the world around us as an interplay between light and darkness, and out of this interplay arises a perception of form. We have then the sense of warmth, our temperature sense, how we relate to the world around us, whether it's hot, whether it's cold. The temperature sense is a very individual thing. We have a sense of hearing, our auditory sense, which in a very limited sense could be the hearing of tone, sound, noise. But in its more cultivated form, it is also this process of listening. Rudolf Steiner describes this as one of the higher or human social senses because of the role of true hearing in the sensing of another human being. Then we have some of the most intangible senses. The sense of language or the sense of word. The sense of language is a recognition of language sounds, for example, grammatical structure, as specific from hearing sound. So our capacity to recognize language as language. Then we have the sense of thought, could also be called a sense of cognition or the sense of concept. We can experience the thoughts of the other person as conveyed through speech or text or even to an extent gesture, because Rudolf Steiner describes thought and cognition as different from language. And we will look at that in quite some detail when we get to that. Finally, we have the sense of ego, the sense of self. When one speaks about the ego, or in anthroposophy one speaks about the I or the I organization, ich, one is generally speaking about one's internal I as in capital I. However, the sense of ego is a sense of the ego of the other person. It is an awareness that others have feelings, thoughts, ambitions, actions like our own. That the other person is an I being. This is very important in terms of cultivating empathy and a capacity for a true feeling for one another, because you are engaging in a process of mutual recognition. As we visit each of the senses through proceeding talks, we will explore each in much greater detail. As well as the division into lower, middle, and higher senses, there are a number of other useful ways we can consider or divide the senses. The first of these is as a series of opposites. This is most striking in the relationship between the lower and the upper senses. So, for example, the sense of touch gives you the experience of boundaries to your own body, but also in terms of personal space, a more energetic experience of touch. Its mirror image is the sense of ego, this breaking of the superficial boundary of the other to arrive at the perception of them as a person with an internal life and boundaries of their own also. In the sense of life we experience the life forces or etheric as they work in our body, and as a mirror image, as an opposition across this great wheel, we have the perception of these liberated forces as thought. We have this development of an initial quality also in the sense of own movement. Own movement or bodily relation has across from it the sense for language, or the development of coordinated and coherent sounds out of a kind of contracted movement, which can also be seen in the tongue and larynx. We also have this mirroring of the sense of balance as a spatial relation in the transformed social sense of hearing. Here listening is denoting more than the capacity to differentiate sound. It is a balancing act to cultivate a true and mutual listening. There are various ways of mirroring the senses to show metamorphoses of characteristics. We can also speak about the senses and the sense groupings as having a fourfold nature. For example, touch is a physical sense, I and it. The sense of life observes the life or etheric body. The The sense of own movement can perhaps be brought into connection with the astral as the subtle body of movement, and so on. The point of this isn't to give long lists of immutable Aristotelian correspondences where everything has a fixed value, but rather to show some possibly fruitful avenues for inquiry. Another division is that between the more physical, including the senses of the body, being touch, life, own movement and balance, and the senses of taste and smell as physical molecular senses, and on the other hand, more ethereal senses. The ethereal senses include the social or supersensible senses of human interaction, and the senses of warmth and sight, which deal with more ethereal, process-based sense experiences, such as light and darkness, hot and cold. In his lectures, Rudolf Steiner speaks about another division of the senses, the conscious senses, which he enumerates at 7, and 5 predominantly subconscious senses. The 5 sub- or unconscious senses are the 4 lower senses plus smell. Smell is designed to evoke emotional responses, memories, impulses like desire and repulsion, but these sense experiences tend to go through the feeling in a half-asleep way rather than through a cognitive process. Our next step is to look at the participatory aspect of sense research. We don't look coldly through our senses as if through a microscope. We experience them. We live and breathe through them. We are part of the method. And as important as the sensations are, we also have to explore how we are moved by and move the sensations within us. How experiences pass through the windows of the senses and into the soul. Through thinking or cognition, through feeling or emotional impact or emotional connection, and through the will as a seed of action. I say a seed of action because it is an impulse towards acting, but the deed is already an outer rather than inner aspect of this process. As an analogy, albeit a limited and imperfect one, we can think of the senses being the windows to our inner house, the soul. The sense impression passes into the house. The soul sees it, either engaging with it or letting it slip away. We cognize or recognize. We consider what we are experiencing. This may also bring thoughts or leave a sufficient impression that it becomes a memory. That which is experienced can also impact us emotionally. It can hurt us, it can please us, it can trigger an emotional response. The senses can also inspire action. Inner action in the sense of imaginative thought, as a development of an impetus, but also outer action in the world. Here we have the other aspect of the house, the door. Deeds are those impulses of will which develop into fruits of action. So we have these two counter images, sensation and deeds. The sense experience comes in through the window. You could think about it perhaps as art appreciation. And then at the other end of that process, if it stirs us sufficiently, it transforms in such a way that it becomes a deed. We can think about this polarity as art creation. We have to consider not just the sense organ or the sense experience, but the inner experience that arises, that enter through the windows of the soul. Coming to an understanding of how other people are constituted and what help they may need, there is another way we can look at the senses. This perspective can also include our personal search for self-understanding and healing. This particular perspective tool comes from the Dutch anthroposophical doctor, Dr. Edmund Schorl. It's essentially a diagnostic tool in the widest sense, and it allows us to look at what may negatively impact healthy sensation and how we can improve sensory function. So this is a fourfold model. It is physical, etheric, astral, and I or ego. We start with the physical. To be able to sense, we must first have a properly formed physical sense organ. Some people are born deaf or blind. There are various issues that can arise prenatally. The physical sense organ can also become damaged through the course of life. Then we have the physiology or working of the life body through the senses. Here the question may be, is the sense organ healthy? Are the physiological processes working as they should? Is there a healthy rhythm of sense perception with proper rest and recovery, or are we burning out through sensory overload? Then we have an astral component. We have the astral body and the relationship between sleeping and waking. When we sleep, we mostly don't sense what is going on around us, while the unconscious part of us is keeping us alive and well. The soul, or the astral body, doesn't have the curtains of these windows of the senses open, and is focused on inner or higher worlds. When we sleep, we are not conscious of the world around us. To engage with the world and to engage through our senses, we must be awake. A general tendency towards sleepiness, or a tendency towards being too awake or overstimulated, can impact how much we really see, how much we really experience through the senses, how much we internalize and work with sense experiences within our soul. As the final aspect, we have the I or the ego. Finally, we must be motivated to willfully look out through the window. The driver of our human experience is the ego organization or I, but that driver needs the power of will to engage with the body, the world, and with other people. Without anyone inside the house to look out through the windows of the soul, there can be no meaningful immersion in sense experience, and no motivation towards action arising from sensory experience. I go through these various aspects because this model is one we will return to again and again as we look at the senses. What is the archetypal sense experience? How is that experienced and developed through our inner life or soul? What impairments may stand in the way of these processes? And when working therapeutically, including self-healing, how can we help heal or bridge these impairments? From here I would like to go in a slightly more esoteric direction, asking what significance the number 12 has in relation to the senses. As early as 1906, Rudolf Steiner began privately connecting the senses to the 12-fold zodiac. As I mentioned earlier, Rudolf Steiner's method is a reformulation of occult science, taking what is useful, including the rich visual and symbolic language human beings have immersed themselves in for thousands of years, while bringing it into a form suitable for the modern human being. There are a number of different places where Rudolf Steiner indicates a possible relationship between the zodiac and the senses. In his books and lectures, he doesn't give a finished schema. His work with the senses and the zodiac was very much a work in progress, and is something often found in his private notebooks, as it was an area he was still grappling with during the last years of his life. For example, these are images of possible zodiacal attributions from Rudolf Steiner's notebooks. The interesting thing is that each of these completely different schemas comes from his notebooks from 1921, only 4 years before his death. Each attribution is a window for exploring possible significances, but none are finished or definitive, despite attempts by some to standardize a system of correspondence. I always try to work with a spirit of movement and playfulness, even with these so-called fixed stars. As with anything that is lived with, mileage may vary. There are many different ways of attributing the zodiac to the 12 senses, and from a certain perspective, by not giving us a definitive link or correspondence, it leaves us free to do our own research, including action research. How does this work in practice? How can this be moved artistically and meditatively? How can these senses be understood practically in the fields of healing, art, education, amongst others? Rudolf Steiner offers a few ways to explore the zodiac in its own right. Of course, there is lecture material on the zodiac, and there is a development of astrosophy, a reformed astronomical and astrological science, looking at the relationship between the human being and the cosmos. Artistically, we have eurythmy gestures for the 12 signs of the zodiac. Steiner also developed a series of 12 zodiacal verses, published in English as the 12 Moods. Meditatively, Rudolf Steiner offered 12 virtues, 12 qualities that have a metamorphic development of qualities that we can work on and which are zodiacal in nature. Finally, as ways to connect with the zodiacal realm, we have the work of the artist Ima von Eckartstein. Under the guidance of Rudolf Steiner, developed 12 designs for a renewed zodiac for our time. It was published in the original Calendar of the Soul. Steiner recommends people work artistically with these images, recreating them annually. While I'm not going to ascribe ways to work with the zodiac, nor how to attribute them to the senses, for those who may be interested, these resources are ways to work with the zodiacal archetypes. If one wanted to work with them alongside the work of the senses, one could take one of the verses from 12 Moods, the eurythmy gesture, the virtue, or work with the zodiacal images artistically, or any combination of these, alongside an exploration of the senses. It would probably be most fruitful to work with these in the respective zodiacal sign as one passes through the year. So this series of talks and also this work with the zodiac is seen as a little bit of a project to span the next year. This has been a very broad introduction to the possibility of exploring the senses. We will unfold a more detailed study of these at the Christian community for those who would like to join this work. Because this format can feel very static, and I usually try to move this content in a very different way with a live, non-digital audience, you're very welcome to email me with questions, comments, or feedback. I'd like to finish today with a verse, something to take forward into your reflections and to work with the senses, zodiac, and fixed stars as a kind of leading image. The stars spoke once to man. It is world destiny that they are silent now. To be aware of this silence can become pain for earthly man. But in the deepening silence there grows and ripens what man speaks to the stars. To be aware of this speaking can become strength for spirit, man. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to our work together in the coming months.